evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Firstly, are you surprised by the decision?
Tapiso, if you look at the diplomatic relations that have happened in recent time with Rwanda and France, it is not surprising that this move has been taken by the court in France. And I guess it comes at the backdrop of those diplomatic imperative between the two countries in making sure that they turn a page on a long history of simultaneous relationship between the current regime in Kigali and Paris.
So the court arguing that the investigation was complete and sufficient charges did not exist for anyone against anyone for committing the alleged crimes or any other infraction. Perhaps let's just start with the background, what happened on that day and what these families were asking for.
Yeah, well, you would know that the genocide in 1994 in Rwanda happened after a long history of events, and one perhaps should mention that the genocide did not just happen in a vacuum. Prior to that, there have been a long history in that particular country of really not so nice good relationship between the communities owing to the historical or even colonial status of the country. So if you look at it from the chronological point of view, you see that the first happened in around 1923-25, then you have in the early 50s, then in the late 50s, around 1959, which is known as the, the Rwandan revolutions, and then culminated to the 1994 genocide. Each of those periods, there has been a community which has been aggrieved or lost their lives on the other side. However, if you look at the political trajectory and the history of those events as well, it's always about the history of the victor, which is much the case across the world, that the victor writes the history and the narrative of what is happening. So talking about Rwandan genocide, it's always a very thorny issue for any political commentator who understands too well the context in which it happened, as well as the history of the Great Lakes region in a sense. So I leave it there, not to dwell too much on the greater details, but you would know that, of course, the event is said to have been triggered by that particular shooting of the plane of Habyarimana. I wouldn't say that that is not the only event, but what followed subsequently after the shooting is what has been a subject of contestation. If you ask those who were in power at the time, they would say that the current government was responsible for igniting the genocide. And if you ask those who are in power in Kigali at this moment, they will tell you that those who were in power at the time are the genocide there. So there is always a history on both sides of the coin.
I suppose, Nixon, it's important to reflect on that because, as you say, the genocide was not just, as it's being reduced to Hutus and Tutsis dislike or hate of each other. France, the role that it played, the failures of the United Nations, and of course the rumors, because if we look at this case in particular, we understand that a team of French experts said that the missiles themselves were from President Habyarimana's camp. There are those who said there were those who were satisfied with President Habyarimana's moderate views from those who felt that he could have been harder on the internal politics in the country. So those wounds have not healed. Where does it put the political trajectory, particularly of the Great Lakes region? The conflicts continue along that area, and it does also find resonance in some of these events that we're describing now.
I think what we have just highlighted the results of the French experts talking about the missiles coming from Habyarimana's own presidential elite, where there are different conclusions to that particular investigation, while pointing to the RPF led by the current president, Paul Kagame. And in this case, you have the likes of General Kayumba Nyamwasa saying that he's willing to testify at any court to justify that indeed they shot down the plane that was carrying Habyarimana. So you have these, conflicting reports based on who do the investigations. And I think if you ask me where to put the politics of the Great Lakes region, you would see that those who ran in Eastern DRC close to over 200,000 civilians, including had followed by the subsequent rebellion that was led by AFDL that brought Laurent Kabila to power. And you recall that the refugees who were in Eastern DRC were said to have been massacred by the groups that came along the side of Kabila's rebellion. So it is quite a complex matter if you it talks about the history of the Great Lakes region, because what is currently happening in the Eastern DRC is a kind of an extension of what happened in Rwanda. And anyone who tried to give a counter narrative, a different perspective, you either seen by the regime in Kigali as a genocide denialist, while if you talk to the victims of those who lost their families, for instance, in the forest of the Eastern DRC, places like Tinga, the camps like Mugunga, just on the outskirts of Goma, they will tell you that the Rwandan forces killed them. They are similar story, for instance, the Kibeho massacres, where the refugees gathered and then were killed by quote-unquote RPF soldiers. So you have these conflicting reports coming from the different views based on who carry out the investigation and based on what particular interest they are pursuing in the matter. So I recall I began by saying that is a complex history that is based on who you talk to. And in this case, the victor always have an upper hand if you look at the history, how it unfolded in that region, of course.
Right. I mean, the question also then becomes who is the victor at this point. If one has read or heard even the survivor accounts of that period, it's very difficult to read, to process. And last year, you had Rwanda's President Paul Kagame on a visit by President Emmanuel Macron of France, saying this relationship is about the future and not the past. You had Emmanuel Macron asking for forgiveness and not making an apology, and people splitting hairs about that. That is significant. So these latest events, where do they put France's relationship with Rwanda, particularly President Kagame, going forward? But those who may view France in a light other than that of hope.
Well, you have to look at both sides of the coin. On the other hand, you have France, which was support of Habyarimana's regime, leading up even to the operation of all Habyarimana's military going into Eastern DRC. And it is not surprising that you would see Rwanda took a step in even banning the French from its curriculum until recently, when it was returned, when they started to mend the relationship. So if you ask me about France's relationship in the Great Lakes region, in particular with Rwanda, it is anchored around a vested interest. What interest does France have in the region? Whether to continue play a particular role around the economic and the geostrategic issues that are within the region, and who is the player at that particular point in time. So it's not surprising that there have been a diplomatic rapprochement between Kigali and Paris, and that is based on the developments. Perhaps France sees that hanging on this old relationship during Habyarimana will not serve its own interest in the region. But on the other hand, also pursuing perhaps Rwanda on key induction that the French courts did earlier, indicting key Rwandan officials for having been accused for triggering the massacre, could be another aspect to look at. But at this point in time, I think it's more of economic interest that is pushing these changes that we see, to the extent that you'd recall Macron coming to Kigali just of recent, about a week ago. The CEO of Total Energy, which is a French company, was in Kigali to partner with the Rwandan government on renewable energies and so on. So you have to look at these different nuances around the genocide, around the geostrategic issues that come from the region, and coupled with that, you look at also the character of leaders within the region, but also the shift in alliances in the context of the Great Lakes region, and that will give you a clear picture of who is in charge here, or to whose interests are being served. And it is not surprising that Rwanda had to send its military in Mozambique to kind of save French investment, in the case of which is Total in the natural liquefied gas in Cabo Delgado. So those are issues that you cannot ignore while talking about the issues of France and the Rwanda relationship, based on its historical context, especially when it comes to the genocide, but notwithstanding the fact that France had a hand in supporting Habyarimana and the regime for genocide.